Hey, Jamal.
Oh, oh, it's up.
Yeah. I read your message. It was just like so early, and I was trying to like, have my Zen breakfast and my Zen time, get to work and do my job. So I forgot to respond to you, but I got you. Like, you're doing the YouTube though, right? You're just doing the YouTube. I do the Facebook, correct? Okay. Cool. I mean, whatever you want to do. If anything, I guess I forgot what I was talking about. But so just to double check, Michelle, she texted me, she emailed me saying that we're not going to use the first three clips. So the only one the only one in the monologue is Biden says his gut says not vote. Okay, copy that. Copy that. All right. And I did tell her that I won't have enough time to drop it for your queue if she comes up with another clip. I told her that it won't be enough time. I might not be able to make it by the time you're calling it. So cool. Well, it's sad. So I feel for you. I was looking forward to no, because I recently became an American citizen like a year and a half ago, but I was gonna vote for Bernie this time. If he was gonna make it, and now I don't like even know what to do.
It hurts.
Oh, hold on. What's up with Bob? What's up with Bob?
You hear me?
All right, hold on. Let me add him. Adding him now.
Hey.
Hey, you're good?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, Jamal. I just Bob was texting me and stuff. All right, so we got 1 minute, and I'm gonna put you guys on mute.
Tomorrow, Michelle says she has a clip.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my disembodied co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Get ready to go against the grain. We have another great show for you today. As you know, the elections in Wisconsin were held yesterday in the midst of a pandemic. You've often heard me say that elections are like holidays on this show, but I think Bob will agree with me. What took place yesterday was not a political holiday. It was an immoral disaster pushed by hacks like Joe Biden and Republican Party in Wisconsin, disregarding the health and life of the various people of those populations entirely for their political ambitions. Shame on all of you. Shame on all of you. We'll have Jim Carpenter from Progressive Democrats of America from Milwaukee to discuss what it was like on the ground with something like 3% of Wisconsin voters braving the disaster in health in order to push their constitutional right to vote. Just to make a point, a rational society does not behave in this way. In the second hour, we'll have comedic political talent of the man that has the greatest resemblance to white Jesus than any man walking the earth today. Host of Redacted Tonight, Lee Camp. He'll be here to discuss my pet political infatuations. What does political accountability mean? What does it look like? What is the left after Sanders? Also, the big news of the day, Trump firing the cop that was supposed to oversee the expenditures of the $2 trillion corporate bailout. Yes, they're throwing crumbs to the masses, but the issue is, where is the bulk of that money going? And the cop that was supposed to be on the beat overseeing it, Trump just got rid of for reasons of, wait for it, disloyalty. Reasons of disloyalty. Last but not least, it's Wednesday. Today is one of my favorite segments, Mysteries. As my producer put it in the promo, and a lot of UFO stuff, that is what an Aries moon in the 8th house opposition Pluto looks like in real life. Personally, I think it adds a unique component to our channel, putting us ahead of the curve on something that elements of the government are clearly trying to expose, but only going as far as we can defend whatever we are saying. That is a unique perspective. Also, today just so happens to be the day that Stephen Greer released his movie, or at the very least last night. There's a section of that movie that I wish to discuss because I think Greer is on to something, and it goes beyond UFOs into the hooks of the intelligence community in the way the information is being released to the public about this particular phenomena. It raises concerns that should be discussed that I've been talking about actually for the last 2 years. But let's start here. As I noted in the earlier section, we had an election to occur yesterday. Now, I typically celebrate these elections, grand shows of democracy and all of the political, I'm a political animal, but I will not be celebrating what took place yesterday. Yesterday was a sham. Joe Biden, the Republican Congress legislature in Wisconsin, backed, co-signed by the Republican Supreme Court, held an election in the middle of a pandemic. Our Surgeon General said it would be like a 9/11 moment. 404,056 cases, 3,721 new cases, 12,988 deaths. Joe Biden, the Republican legislature, Supreme Court says, yes, let's have an election on that particular day. Why? Because they wanted to get their political ambitions. The Republican legislature and the Republican Supreme Court pick was up for the vote. The Republican legislature knew and understood that there was an imbalance in the number of Democrats versus Republicans, where Republicans had an advantage. So they needed the election to be held on that date. They didn't care about the life and health of the various people who were going to the polling locations. It needed to be held that day. Joe Biden knows that he can collapse at any moment. He is barely cognitively, absolutely challenged, which means he needs to have that election held on that very specific day. Life and limb of the individuals don't matter. Let that sink in and nurse a quiet rage about that. And don't let it be quiet for long. Just let that sink in. For their political ambitions, they were willing to risk life and limb of the individuals in Wisconsin. And after all of it's said and done, Joe Biden comes out and says, we probably shouldn't have had that election. Let's hear the clip.
Do you think you won in Wisconsin tonight? Ordinarily, I'd be hitting you over the head with all these exit polls and crosstabs and things that I know about people all the way down to what they like for lunch. We're not going to have anything until Monday. What's your gut?
No, we're not. Well, my gut is that we shouldn't have had the election in the first place. The in-person election. It should have been all mail ballots in. It should have been moved in the way that 5 other states have done it. It's the idea didn't have enough poll workers in over 100 and some polling places in Milwaukee.
That rat bastard. That rat bastard. He had been pushing for this election all the way up until like the day before the election, and now afterwards he turns around and says, yeah, my gut tells me we shouldn't have had that. How stupid do you think people are? You put all of those people's lives over. 70% of the people who died or who got ill were African Americans in the COVID-19 crisis in Chicago. Meaning, the people who you are looking for to put you in that office are the people who are most susceptible to this disease, and you are perfectly willing to put their lives on the line in order to get your decrepit, shuffling, cognitively challenged stuff over the finish line. I was going to have a longer monologue on that, but that's not the news for today. The big news for today is that Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the primary. It hurts. Bernie Sanders has dropped out the primary. Bob Schlehuber, my co-host, my wingman, broke the news to me. He broke it to me like a hospital, like a doctor, breaking into a patient that they had cancer, because he knew what was going to do to me. Bernie Sanders has dropped out the primaries. How weak. How weak. I've said before that my feelings of Sanders are complicated. And they're complicated in part because I accept that Bernie Sanders has done remarkable things in regards to moving this argument about lefty politics into the mainstream, shifting the Overton window, shifting the hegemonic norm in regards to what it means to be a lefty and the policies, and realizing that those policies, for 50 years, you've had a Democratic Party that tells you that the things that you wanted, the things that you believed in, the things that you knew and understood about the world, saying that the world is it's irrational. We should be working to the benefit of humanity and making our world a better place. And you had a Democratic Party, third-wave Democrats telling you the public isn't on board for that. The public doesn't like that. Those policies aren't popular. Those aren't good policies. And maybe you can make that argument during the Reagan era, but here's the catch. Environments change. And as environments change and the conditions of the people in those environments, as they change, so do their political priorities. They find things to be fair or unfair. So you have a youth that has thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on their back, and you ask them, is that fair? They would say no. You go back to a Reagan era and have that conversation. Maybe that conversation doesn't take place because maybe that's not necessarily an issue for that era. I'm making the point that your environment changes. And as your environment changes, so do the individuals in that environment, their political inclinations. They change. So you get to this era, and you've had neoliberals, third-wave Democrats tell you for 40, 50 years, incrementalism is the best that you can do. You got to take all of this money in order to get anything accomplished. And the best that you can get accomplished is small incremental stuff because you don't necessarily want to challenge the people who give you that money. That's what they've said. And that's what's soaked into the fabric of the individuals in our society, deadening their expectations, deadening their imaginations of getting anything done from the standpoint of what government can do. They haven't seen this notion of what government can do because they haven't been alive at a time where you had a party where government did anything. But here's the catch. Government is doing something. It's putting in policies that is expropriating the wealth from the lower classes to the top. Don't get in your mind that government is not doing anything. It is doing that remarkably well. Whether it's that Bush tax cut, whether it's Obama enshrining that tax cut in the law, whether it's Obama giving 95% of the income to the top 1%, it does that remarkably well, which is kind of my point. From the standpoint of the left, if you want to get policy items accomplished, they have told you that what you wanted was unpopular. And now you find out with Sanders running that not only can you run a campaign without taking their cash, not only that your policies are popular, not only winning the argument even in states that Sanders lost, your policy issues across the board from the standpoint of the Democratic Party was in line with what they wanted. And yes, they end up choosing Joe Biden. But be honest when you're thinking about what happened in this particular race. Every last element of the Democratic Party establishment lined up against you and your priorities in order to stop you and Sanders from exceeding the race. That is literally what took place. The media apparatus, the oligarchs, all of these things lined up against you. But here's the catch. You knew that going in. You knew that everybody who wasn't named Sanders going in was going to be against Sanders. What I wanted out of this was a ruthless, fanatical, righteous indignation with a sense of urgency that Sanders went after this particular election with the thought that I'm going to do everything that's possible to win this because everything else is subordinate to my cause. And what is that cause? 500,000 people losing their health insurance. 70 to 80% of the population living paycheck to paycheck. persistently vulnerable, a quarter of the population of kids living in poverty. What is the life of a child who's growing up in that way? And what is the effect on society as that child grows up in that way? We don't think about these things, but these are things that Sanders put on the block for conversation, and you realize those things are popular. And yet they chose Joe Biden. And you ask yourself, why? Sanders was winning all of the other racial demographics, so you can't necessarily say it was an issue of people of color. He was winning people of color, except for African Americans. Sanders lost this race on the back of African Americans. Here's the catch. You can't blame African Americans. You have, everybody has some level of strife and problems in their life. Doesn't matter the person. There's always something that plagues them. In the context of the thing that plagues them, they can't accept that as just an answer for them to not do X or to do Y. There are things in their life that they want to accomplish. You just have to overcome those things. My kidneys don't work. Fair enough. That doesn't stop me from traveling the world. Yes, there were things that you had to exchange. Sometimes it was cash, sometimes it was pain, sometimes it was feeling poorly. But at the same token, you had something that you wanted to accomplish. You had an objective, and everything else was subordinate to the objective. That's what I want. That's the way I focus on politics. And so when I look at Sanders, that's what I expect him to do in this race. But on issues of race, he would not bring up Joe Biden's line about civil rights. On issues of race, he wouldn't bring up the line about South Africa. He wouldn't necessarily bring up the fact that Biden is lying about civil rights and take a righteous indignation about it, where he's angry about it. I marched with King, and this man is lying about the civil rights movement. Would that be enough to win? I don't know, but don't you have to go there considering what happened? He lost 3-1, the black vote. Why? Because he's making an affirmative argument when really an affirmative argument was insufficient to get what he needed in regards to that race. That race was won and lost in South Carolina. Yes, Elizabeth Warren held Sanders down why Biden took the killing blow. But understand, that race was won and lost in South Carolina, and that was the exact particular play that Sanders would not be willing to do. Why? Because despite of all the pain and anguish that he is in this race to handle, Joe Biden is his buddy. Joe Biden is his buddy. Now he's out the race. No imagination in regards to what he could potentially do as a senator, as a leader of a movement in this moment of a pandemic. Can't change the campaign around, can't change and use his base and the leverage of that base to put a condition on whether or not they should support Joe Biden. Can't do any of that stuff. You automatically give it over. Bob, I am so pissed off. And I'm going to hand it over to you to get your opinion on this as opposed to just raging out.
Well, I think you have every right to rage out right now. It is frustrating. As we talked about, the political calculus of this moment changed so dramatically, not over the last 3 months alone, but the last month alone has shown that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party do not have the policies in place to properly respond. And I thought it was a big moment for Sanders to continue to amplify his call for socialism, for universal pay to people that are struggling right now. It seems like he's one of the leading voices in the Senate. It seemed like an opportune moment. But going back to the DNC, they were pretty adamant that this last debate that was supposed to happen between Joe Biden and Sanders was not going to happen. Obviously, voting fears around the country. People, I think Sanders has always been kind of gun shy. He doesn't want to be pointed as the person that continued to make Democrats across the country go out and vote for either him or Joe Biden. And for the Democratic Party, I think they're thankful right now. The convention that was supposed to take place in July in Milwaukee already being pushed back, or at least significant changes will happen to that. A lot less pressure now on that convention because they will have a clear nominee if Joe Biden is able to be hidden from public and no one has to hear him speak between now and then. He'll still seemingly be the nominee. This is the best case scenario for the DNC, for the Democrats. I honestly think as long as they can just stay quiet until November, they'll simply make it a referendum against Donald Trump. This is the best case scenario for Joe Biden. He does not have to put out another single policy position. He can simply say, look, I'm the guy that's going to unite the country through these hard times. I'm not Donald Trump. Vote for me, which ultimately, Jamal, I was saying yesterday on the show, it's not a vote for Joe Biden. It's going to be a referendum on Donald Trump come November. With that, we have to head to a quick break. When we return, we'll be talking about the continued assault on the environment under the cloak of COVID-19, and we will head back to Wisconsin a day after their in-person elections. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's
a tic-tac UFO, man. Just like the one the U.S. Navy caught on video in 2004, but only came clean about it last year.
No, I'm pretty sure it was a bird.
Whatever.
Get nerdy on Wednesdays with Revelations, the Political Misfits look into the world's mysteries and a lot of UFO stuff.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser for Double Down, a new show on Sputnik with Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert. Everybody's doubling down. Central bankers are doubling down. Gambleaholics are doubling down. Everyone's doubling down. Why don't you double down? Right here at Sputnik with a new show called Double Down with Max and Stacey. Bye, y'all.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas. We continue here on 105.5 FM. Possibly you're listening and watching on the Progressive Soapbox on YouTube or following us live on Facebook, SputnikNews.com, or potentially you're listening to us delayed on a podcast later on this evening, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker. We're on all of those platforms and more. Check us out wherever you can find us, Political Misfits. We continue to talk about the attacks on the environment during the COVID-19 pandemic and how the rash of nefarious decisions made by the Trump administration in this moment may lead to more deaths in the long run than we may see from COVID-19. Here to talk more about this effort and the effort to fight back is Chad Nicholson, Pennsylvania community organizer for the Community Environment Legal Defense Fund. Chad, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Chad, an unprecedented month to say the least, especially when it comes to the full-on attack being waged against the environment under the cover of the pandemic. The Trump administration has moved to suspend much of the EPA's enforcement, push to roll back 2012 standards targeting car pollution, and the Department of Interior has continued offering up millions of acres in public lands for sale to oil and gas companies. Watchdogs are now expecting the EPA to finalize its rollback of a coal power plant standard that limits the brain-damaging mercury and arsenic they release. Chad, unprecedented times to say the least.
Absolutely, and can't say that I'm surprised, to be honest. Under this administration, obviously the EPA's protections and regulations have been rolled back. But I do have to take a bit of a contrary position as well and say that for a long time, a lot of the environmental protection agencies and other regulatory agencies, rules and regulations in this country have not been adequate to protect the environment. So I'm definitely not surprised by what's going on right now, but also want to recognize that for the past 20 or 30 years, the regulations that have been put in place by the EPA and other state regulatory agencies have been inadequate to actually protect the health and safety of the communities. So it is unprecedented. Definitely not happy about it. Clearly going to have bigger impacts on communities that are impoverished or have concentrations of people of color. That's clearly coming to the forefront as well. But I also wanted to take an opportunity, if we have a minute, to talk about an actual win that we got over the last couple of weeks, which is also unprecedented. So
I absolutely want to talk about the Grant Township in Pennsylvania and the win that you guys have been able to get there. I do want to first stay on what you had mentioned there of not doing nearly enough. Big breaking news of the day here. Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign. It seems like it'll clear the path for Joe Biden. And that's a great concern for me, Chad. I don't know where you sit politically, but the Democratic establishment, the Joe Bidens of the world, talk so much about the Paris Climate Agreement and that on day one of his administration, he would look to enter back into it. But if people are following it, and to the point you were making, this isn't nearly enough to actually implement the sweeping changes across the board that need to take place. I mean, we need to ban fracking. We need to rethink about how corporations pollute. A carbon tax isn't going to do nearly enough. All of these different measures are not going to be prioritized within the Biden administration, at least from his own presentation of where his policies are so far. It is greatly concerning to see that nobody now, Trump or Biden, are going to have the loud enough voices on what really needs to take place.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, we don't, at least in my organization, don't do a lot with national politics. We work much more at the grassroots level. I will say that over the years, Bernie has stood with some of the communities that we've worked with in Pennsylvania and Ohio and has expressed support for their local efforts. So this seems to be a blow for that. But overall, I think when we talk about real structural, meaningful change at the national level, it's going to have to be coming from a much more organized and motivated grassroots effort to actually force the change upwards, no matter who's in the presidency or who's in Congress. That really meaningful change is going to have to come from the bottom.
Yeah, and we see corporations fighting their way to not allow grassroots movements to take hold whatsoever. I think now of PG&E, the Pacific Gas and Electric company that's based in San Francisco. The company back in 2018 had helped spark the California wildfires and were set to pay upwards of $13.5 billion settlement with those victims that it was responsible for having killed in those fires breaking out, Chad. And so you see these major corporations in this moment basically being empowered by the federal government to continue to find ways around not paying their bills. PG&E is arguing basically because of the shaky economy and their efforts to get out of bankruptcy, they're not necessarily going to be able to pay that $13.5 billion back as planned, or will look for every which way to basically push back. And as you alluded to there, Chad, there are some efforts to push back at local levels that we should highlight and that hopefully will inspire those in California looking to hold PG&E accountable. That is in the legal battle there, Chad, you took place in and helped win by Grant Township in Pennsylvania. In an extraordinary reversal in late March, the Pennsylvania Department of Environment Protection, the DEP, revoked a permit for a frac waste injection well in Grant Township. DEP officials cited Grant Township's home rule charter banning injection wells as grounds for their reversal. Township residents popularly adopted a home rule charter, basically a local constitution in 2015 that contains a community bill of rights. The charter bans injection wells as a violation of the rights of those living in the township and recognizes rights of nature. The Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund assisted in drafting the charter. That's you, Chad. Tell us more about this case, Chad, and what blueprint it sets for local communities to protect their own land and the environment around them.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to Grant Township. I did want to comment quickly on the PG&E stuff, which I've been following. I used to live in Northern California as well, so it's an issue that's dear to me. But, there was the settlement that they entered into with thousands and thousands of the victims from the fires. And a part of that settlement, was that they were going to get basically stock from PG&E to compensate the victims. And that now that stock is going way down, but because of the pandemic, as well as, PG&E's stock is just low because nobody really wants to invest in them given their past history. But what it illustrates to me is that in types of settlements like that, the corporations generally know that they're going to be able to write things in a way where they will ultimately be absconded, basically, or they won't have to be fully responsible for their actions, and that it will be left to the victims, the people in the communities holding the bag. The ones that, thought they were getting a good deal, that thought that the settlement was going to protect them, but that ultimately the system of law, the way the courts are set up, the way these settlements are written, the way the lawyers negotiate, there are built-in protections that help the corporations when push comes to shove about who's actually going to be, responsible for the actions of that corporation. And it's something that we've seen, thousands and thousands of times across this country over the last 30, 40 years, going back further than that as well, where the system protects the interests of the industries at the expense of the health and safety of communities. And so what's happening with PG&E doesn't surprise me at all. I'm outraged, but it's the way the system is. And I think
Chad, just to speak to that, the system as a whole, basically the latest news coming after the lawyers for the plaintiffs, some 84 families who had their loved ones lost to them, charged their PG&E with involuntary manslaughter. They went to send out a letter basically saying, look, PG&E is not meeting the requirements, and the judge for the case said, no, you cannot do that. So here's the court, another part of the system, protecting the corporation.
Absolutely. Yeah, the judge ruled on behalf of PG&E. Outrageous, yes. Surprised, I'm not. And I think that's a really good setup for Grant Township. And I'll just try to give a little more background and context to what you provided. So Grant Township has been fighting off a frac waste injection well for the past 7 years. If listeners aren't familiar, frac waste injection wells are basically a toilet for the fracking industry where they dump all of the waste produced from the frac operations. And so The waste can be radioactive. There's been a lot of reporting done on that recently about how hot it is, how radioactive it is when it comes out of the ground. It can contain toxic contaminants like toluene and benzene, which are cancer-causing agents. They've also caused earthquakes in other states, like in Ohio and Oklahoma and California. They've been shut down there by other state regulator agencies because of the harms they're, inflicting on these communities. So they're bad things. They're, a host of harms that go along with them. Grant Township, small, rural, poor, about 700 people, basically in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania, understood the risks of these things, though. And they were trying to keep the thing from coming into the community. And just so folks are aware, they still have been able to keep it out to date. But the EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, issued a permit for the injection well back in 2013. So they legalized the dumping of toxic frack waste in the community. And then their own state Department of Environmental Protection, so it's another regulatory agency in Pennsylvania, also issued a permit for the injection of that waste. So it's, important just to note here, we have these so-called environmental protection agencies that are legalizing, that are authorizing the dumping of toxic waste into watersheds and communities. So we have to understand that these environmental protection agencies, in our view, don't really protect the environment. They're there to actually legalize and authorize these activities to take place, which then protect the corporations when the corporations mess up the environment. They say, hey, well, we were just acting under the permits that were granted to us by these state or federal agencies. So that's the background. These agencies issued the permits. Grant basically said, well, shit, we've got no other options here. And so we worked with them to take action at the local municipal level to where they passed a law that said, look, we have certain rights. We have a right to self-govern. We have a right to protect our health and safety. The state and federal levels of government are not going to protect us. We have no other option except to do it at the local level, even if that means getting sued. So they went ahead, the corporate lawyers were in the room that night when they passed the initial law, and they went ahead and passed the law anyways. And it said, we're going to ban the injection wells because we know these are bad for our community. Of course, they did get sued in federal court. They eventually lost that case. But then they adopted, even when the federal judge said, hey, Grant Township, you don't have the authority to ban injection wells. A month later, they adopted a new law, this home rule charter that you mentioned, that reinstated the ban on injection wells. So it was actually an act of defiance of the ruling of the federal judge. They said, we're going to reinstate the ban with this new law. At that point, the state DEP got involved. So it wasn't the corporation suing the community at that point. It was the State Department of Environmental Protection that sued the township for trying to protect its environment. Can't overstate that enough. You now have the state stepping in on behalf of the industry to say, hey, we're going to actually take issue with your local law now, and we're going to say that your local law interferes with our ability to carry out state oil and gas policy, which is about legalizing all of this stuff. The state DEP got involved. That case has been going on for 3 years, but then what happened in the stunning reversal a couple of weeks ago, which we still don't know all the behind-the-scenes information on and why they did it, the DEP reversed course, said actually this local law that we've been suing over, we're now going to recognize as a valid, legitimate local law, and we're going to rescind the permit. We're going to remove the permit from the corporation. So it was unprecedented. Basically, this local law that Grant Township passed, which also grants rights to nature, which is a new front in environmental legal strategy, forced the DEP to revoke this permit from an oil and gas company. So we've worked with communities all over the country over the last 10, 15 years with these local laws. And the first time we've actually seen a local law be enforced where a state agency removed and punished basically a corporation for attempting to inject frack waste. So that's where we're at. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying it is a fascinating case, and we've seen other lawsuits that I think are really fascinating in how they're framed. We've seen Juliana versus the United States, the youth climate lawsuit out west, basically a bunch of kids saying Donald Trump and the U.S. federal government are infringing on their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness through their environmental policies and rollback that are infringing on their future. Now here we're seeing a local community basically use a home rule, their own local constitution, to not only fight the federal government, but also the state government, which is also flipping on its head where kind of left-leaning people often are with kind of states' rights versus federal rights, where the local municipality is taking the fight into their own hands. And so I'm curious, Chad, are there other creative ways in which we can fight the environmental catastrophe that are facing us? Obviously, there's different levers to be pulled between lawsuits, between politics, between economic levers. I'm curious where you're seeing the most creative initiatives and where people can most readily get involved.
Yeah, and a lot of folks are particularly interested in the legal side of this case right now. They're like, well, is this precedent setting? Is this going to work for other communities and this and that? And the answer is I don't know. And the legal stuff is interesting. But I think what's more important to note here is that this didn't just happen because of a law that Grant Township passed. This has come from 6 years of agitating and resistance to a system of law that has been telling this community that they have to be poisoned. And so they've agitated, they've passed these laws, they've organized, they've educated other communities. This is really, I think, not about vindicating the DEP's decision. This is about recognizing that this community has had to fight tooth and nail for everything. And what's inspiring here is I think other communities can look at that as an example and say that it's not the law or the courts that are going to save you. It's going to be your willingness to stand up to unjust laws and what you're willing to risk for that. So this township has been willing to risk municipal bankruptcy through these lawsuits. They basically said, we understand that this could lead us into bankruptcy, but the threat of that injection well is going to be more harmful to us than any lawsuit that a company or the state can bring. So that's the attitude that they've had going in. They haven't been looking to the courts or even the laws necessarily to protect them. They just said, we're going to do whatever it takes to keep this thing out and continue to organize around that. So what's, I think, inspiring there is just this dude not looking to a higher level of government or a court to save you, that they've recognized that the only relief they're going to get is if they work to save themselves. And I think, what that points to is needing to be a lot more of these local efforts where communities are unwilling to bow down to the power of the industry or even the state or federal courts and say, we're going to do whatever it takes to protect our rights and to do what we know is right. With the idea that then builds a grassroots movement, which pushes upwards to, what we're now talking about in Pennsylvania and other states is constitutional change. Yeah. Actually, changing the Constitution would make the default in these communities protection, that communities are by default able to protect themselves. And that if a corporation wants to come in, they have to, do the thing and talk to the community if they want. But that the community is in control, not the corporation or even the state regulatory agencies.
Yeah, big shout out. Hopefully some folks in Grant Township, I know you're only 7,000 of you, but I hope one of you is listening. I'm incredibly thankful for the battle that you've been waging there. It's incredibly inspiring. And a big thank you to Chad Nicholson, Pennsylvania community organizer for the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, for his work, as well as for joining us today. Chad, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Bob.
Absolutely. After the break, we head back to Wisconsin to talk about the absurdity of the in-person election being held in that state. And we'll also talk about the health disparities being highlighted by COVID-19 in that state and across the country. Listen to Political Misfits live in DC. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show. This is Tom Luongo of Gold Guts and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamal Thomas. We've been talking about the attacks on the environment. Now we talk about the attacks on democracy. Jamal, I do need to just a status update. Are you still okay? I appreciate your bravery of not sending yourself to the hospital on the news that Sanders has dropped out. I know you're saving every bed for COVID-19 patients, but how are you holding up here 35 minutes into that news?
My feelings, like I tell people, I don't necessarily have feelings that are wet, they get hot. And so it's, a certain degree of sadness, but I'm experiencing it as, like I said, complicated. I mean, like there's this feeling of letdown. There's this feeling of potential that was missed. I mean, we're going to get into it with Lee Camp, but I'm still here. I'm cognitive. I'm competent. I'm braving it along.
It's better than what maybe Joe Biden can say about himself. Jamal, we turn here to the state of Wisconsin. I mean, a bizarre conversation to have about the Democratic presidential primary there being held yesterday in Wisconsin. Obviously, a lot of other people were voting for other seats, specifically the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And then you had municipal elections. Actually, the general elections, the primary in that state, were held for several of the seats back in February. And so yesterday, on April 7th, many actual elections were held for the seats themselves, not just the primaries. Here to talk to us about that and much more is Jim Carpenter, a member of Progressive Democrats of America's Milwaukee chapter and a Sanders campaign volunteer, as well as Rick Baines, political director and organizer with Black Leaders Organizing for Communities. Jim and Rick, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having a progressive station to inform voters about what's going on here in Wisconsin and all over the country.
You bet. And Rick, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Rick, I'll start with you here. A few things that you will encounter during voting in a pandemic. This is from Wisconsin yesterday. You're going to have a shortage of poll workers. You're going to have the need to consolidate many polling places and extremely long lines. So yeah, basically they made everyone go to vote just a few locations and then stand in queues for hours on end. For example, Milwaukee, a city of almost 600,000 people, had just 5 polling places open yesterday. In normal circumstances, they would have 180 polling places. In Green Bay, a city of 105,000 people, was downsized from 31 polling places to just 2. And while plenty of voters, some 1.2 million, attempted to avoid the inconvenience and dangers of in-person voting by voting absentee, that wasn't without problems either, as 538 interviewed Milwaukee voter Erica Tucker, who said that she requested an absentee ballot over 3 weeks ago and just received it on Monday, only to discover the city had sent her the wrong ballot. Rick, I'm just curious, you were on the ground there in Wisconsin yesterday. What was the day like for you?
It was ridiculously intense. Like, I mean, what we saw was first saw that there would be long lines. So as soon as the polls opened, there were lines out the door going down the street. And so literally from the moment polls opened until the well past when polls closed, there was a line out the door. And so the average, person who voted yesterday in person waited an hour to 2 hours towards the end, 2.5 hours towards the end to cast their ballot. And, it was, at the same time, it was very heartening to see so many people, being willing to risk their life in order to cast their votes. There were lots of people out, showing support, providing snacks and water and things like that, comfort to people waiting in line. The weather was very much so on our side, with the exception of maybe about a brief 15 minutes or so where it rained a little bit. But it was an entirely hazardous, unnecessary situation to force, 600,000 people to vote at 5 polling locations. And, something that's not as often talked about is just the disparity between, the cities and the suburbs. You'll have the cities with, I can't remember the exact city, but I think it's like Waukesha or something like that, where, they have a fraction of the population, but almost the same amount of polling locations. And so we very much saw this as, a partisan, a class, and a race-based attack against the city of Milwaukee, where there's a disproportionate amount of people being infected with the coronavirus, that to force us to go out into these conditions in order to participate in a democracy that will have impacts for at least a decade with our state Supreme Court race. To force us into that situation, that choice was it was a weaponizing of a pandemic, and it was
absolutely no criminal in many regards. And as you mentioned, they're in Milwaukee. Blacks are roughly 1/4 of the population and roughly 1/2 of the COVID-19 cases. We'll come back to talk about that and more later in the hour. But Jim, I want to ask you and piggyback off to something there that Rick was talking about. Not only was the presidential primary yesterday, but there was also one of the biggest seats up for election, which was a 10-year term on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. And as people will remember, the governor there, Evers, had basically tried to block the election from taking place on Monday, but it was the Wisconsin Supreme Court that said it must continue as scheduled. In that race, you had incumbent Daniel Kelly, who was appointed to the seat in 2016, who was running against challenger Jill Karofsky. The two won first and second place in the state's open primary in February and faced off yesterday. Bernie Sanders and Biden had endorsed Karofsky. Sanders had said in a statement that judges should stand up for the needs of working people and civil rights, not huge corporate CEOs, which is why I strongly endorse Judge Jill Karofsky for Wisconsin Supreme Court. And on the other side of things, Trump tweeted out an endorsement of Daniel Kelly, writing, quote, tough on crime, loves your military, vets, farmers, and will save your Second Amendment, a big vote. Jim, for me, it was this vote that was probably the most crucial at the state level yesterday, and in my opinion, was one of the reasons the GOP let the Supreme Court in Wisconsin overturn and keep the elections yesterday scheduled as planned. It was after all the state Supreme Courts that overruled the governor and pushed elections forward. What do you think of this?
Well, I think it was really an assault on democracy. This did not have to happen. I mean, other states obviously delayed their elections. Some of those were, I understand, precipitated by the actions of Republicans. So there was no really logical reason to stop this, to not delay this election. Yes, it was a hugely important race for this 10-year Supreme Court, for the Supreme Court. But let me just tell you about my own personal experience yesterday. So normally I have a couple blocks to walk to my polling place. So yesterday I decided to check out one of the place I would have to vote if I voted in person. I had voted by absentee ballot. And so I walked over and took a couple miles walk to get to Riverside High School. When I got to Riverside High School, I saw a scene that I have never seen before in all my years, 71 years old here, in my years as an activist. I saw people lined up for blocks and blocks waiting to get in. Perhaps a mile long of people waiting to get in to vote. As you pointed out, there was only 5 polling places open in Milwaukee, leading to thousands of people having to go to Riverside High School to cast their vote. And then there was a line of cars. I counted at least 100 cars in line trying to get in to vote through by use of their car. And the cars were barely moving. Think of the worst accident you can think of on an expressway. That's how fast these cars were moving. I could walk much faster than these cars were moving. So it was really a surrealistic sight to see all these people lined up trying to cast their ballots. And of course it's going to suppress the vote. I mean, what older person would stand in line? What elderly person would stand in line literally for hours in order to cast a ballot? And then one of my friends who was at another site, who also was a poll worker, she brought up another issue that hasn't been talked about. She said, well, I'm standing in line, but I have to go to the bathroom. Where there was no portable potties I could see out there for people who literally had to relieve themselves as they're standing in line. You know, so the provisions weren't made for the comfort of people, at least as I could see. And you know, the chief health officials in Wisconsin had made it abundantly clear that participating in this in-person election is going to put people at risk. And it's going to send absolutely the wrong message to the people in Wisconsin about the need to stay inside, the need for social distancing, the need for not getting together in big groups. We had literally thousands of people getting together at this one polling site. That's a horrible message to send to people when you're trying to create social solidarity to obey the rules. Now, what happened is thousands of absentee ballots will not be counted. So what they did, well, first of all, let me just say that it was an evolving situation in Wisconsin. People didn't know how dangerous this virus was going to be. Unfortunately, when the lockdown order was made by our governor, the governor didn't immediately call for a delay in the elections. He thought the elections could go on, even though there was many Democrats who wanted to delay the elections. But as this situation with the virus progressed, it became clear that it would be absolutely irrational and irresponsible to have this election take place in person. And so eventually the governor saw this himself. He got a lot of push from our mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, and other elected officials to delay these elections. Eventually he delayed the elections, but as you pointed out, the Supreme Court and the Wisconsin Supreme Court reversed his order to delay the elections, and the problem is that as this situation evolved, there were people who normally go to vote in person, like myself, who eventually were made the decision they're going to have to vote absentee ballot. This is new for a lot of people in Wisconsin who have a tremendous tradition of voting in person. It certainly was new for me as an elderly person. And so we sort of waited to get our absentee ballot, not knowing what the situation would be with the virus. And so we got the absentee ballot rather late in this process. And it took days for me to receive my absentee ballot from the Election Commission. It took 6 days in the mail, and then, of course, you have to mail it back. And so
Jim, I want to jump in right there for the moment, because you're making an extremely good point. And, this is kind of one of those points where, I don't deal with this stuff well. I tend to deal with this stuff with a certain simmering rage. What is the population thinking? I mean, basically, you've had a political contest on a contrived date that you yourself has just said is utterly and entirely irrational in order to pull off on a date like that. Meaning you could always postpone these dates. Right now, as we speak, we've had 15 states postpone their primaries. Alaska, Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Hawaii, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, West Virginia, Wyoming, and Puerto Rico all rescheduled their primaries. The political world did not fall off its axis. It's perfectly okay. This is a contrived date. The public was pushed by a Republican administration and Joe Biden. I'm not taking Joe Biden off the hook on this. Basically, to have this election knowing that these people were going to put life and limb on the line in order to get their particular political objectives accomplished. Does the public understand that in a gut level way? And is there a certain righteous indignation, if not anger, at what had taken place in regards to them pushing this election to take place on that date?
I don't think, yes, anybody who follows the logic of this would have to be angry, because there was no rational reason for not delaying the election. But what I wanted to point out is not only did they not delay the election, but the Supreme Court reversed the order of a federal judge saying that the window for receiving absentee ballots could be extended to Monday to April 13th. The Supreme Court said, no, we can't extend the window for receiving absentee ballots. The absentee ballot had to be postmarked by yesterday, April 7th. So that means a lot of absentee ballots that have never gotten to the voter, they were still in transit in the mail. Those voters could not vote by absentee, because the judge reversed the order about extending the receipt of absentee ballots to the 13th. He made it again the 7th. And there's no way then that these voters could cast an absentee ballot. There was absolutely no reason why they could not leave that extended period for the reception of absentee ballots on April 13th rather than April 7th. So these people then who had not received an absentee ballot had the choice of either not going, not voting, or going to the and vote and put themselves in harm's way. And again, let me repeat, every health official at the top level in the state of Wisconsin said that this was a health risk. If this was not a health risk, you wouldn't have the vast majority of poll workers saying they will not come. And that's what happened. The vast majority of poll workers in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee anyhow, said that they will not come. And these are dedicated public servants. These are not people who do things on a whim. These are dedicated public servants. And for them to say they will not come because they know the dangers involved, it's abundantly clear how irrational it was to hold this election.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Let me just say,
go ahead, Jim.
One more thing. I want to thank, as a Bernie volunteer, I want to thank Bernie Sanders for taking the high road in this election. You know, he could have said, like some candidates said, well, this is what the Supreme Court said. Therefore, why don't you just go to the polls and vote anyway? Because, you know, and get out there and vote. His Bernie dialer, I read it yesterday. I've been using the Bernie dialer for weeks. It never said, listen, you just got to suck it up and now you got to go to the polls. He always focused on ballots, and I applaud him for putting people's welfare above any political consideration.
Yeah, I want to turn our focus of our conversation around some of those disparities there in Milwaukee and other communities across the country that are taking the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I had mentioned, there's huge disparities in Louisiana, Chicago, throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, here in Washington, D.C., of who is being impacted the most heavily by COVID-19. And we continue to speak with Jim Carpenter of PDA Milwaukee chapter, as well as Rick Banks, the political director and organizer with Black Leaders Organizing for Communities. And Rick, this isn't anything new. This wasn't all of a sudden, oh, there are disparities when it comes to health outcomes, economic outcomes, political, social outcomes within poor Black communities across the United States here. And here now we have Bernie Sanders dropping out. It seemingly looks like it'll be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. Donald Trump won the state of Wisconsin in 2016. It seemed like a lot of people were disenfranchised or disillusioned by the Democratic Party, saying we're not going to go back to the establishment. It was great to have Barack Obama, but our material conditions, segregation, those things didn't improve over the last 12 years. And yet the Democrats are going to come back out again and say, no, go back to the old ways with us, the Democratic Party that you know. I'm curious how you think this is going to reverberate as we continue to see the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic, both in terms of the deaths that are going to be faced, as well as the slow recovery that's probably never going to come to a lot of these communities as well. Do you think people are going to check out of electoral politics there, Rick, in the state of Wisconsin, now that Sanders is dropping out?
I absolutely think so. I literally was just on Facebook reading, some comments from people who just saw that Bernie announced that he was dropping out. And their response is like, I just risked my life for you yesterday, and now it's over. Like, what? Like, this doesn't seem fair. And like,
yeah, weird timing, to say the least. That he either should have done this last week or just wait a week or wait until Monday's results come out or over the weekend. But to do it on the heels of voting when people turned out and waited hours in line when the rest of the nation's staying at home. Yeah, it's pretty illy timed announcement, to say the least.
It just contributes to this feeling that people have that, nobody cares for them. Like, nobody cares that I've risked my life. Nobody cares about the conditions that we're living in. The Republicans clearly are willing to just say, you all should go out and risk your life and die in the hopes that, your side loses. And the Democrats, people just don't see us fighting hard enough with, the things that things need to change. At least the young people. I think there's obviously going to be a generational gap, as there has been in the primary, where younger folks are more likely to be, especially more apathetic towards the process and things like that. Than older generation of folks who are more likely to, be willing to support Joe Biden and probably supported him in the primary. But yeah, these disparities are not new. Like, we specifically at Block have been working against these disparities for almost the 2 years that we've been in existence, where there's one hospital pretty much on the far north side of Milwaukee, that's St. Joseph's Hospital, and their owners had announced they were going to reduce services and start to close the one hospital in the Black neighborhood of Milwaukee. We had to fight against that and put a stop to it and get them to say that not only are they not leaving the community, but they're going to actually start to invest in services for that neighborhood. And so, again, we see that is like, we almost lost the one hospital we have. When part of our research, we found that there is no urgent care on the north side of Milwaukee where the greater majority of Black people live. And so what this creates is a healthcare system that is not even in place in a lot of Black communities. And so we don't have access to the healthcare resources as well as the healthy food opportunities and things like that. And so that stuff is going to contribute to people having lesser health outcomes, people having more of those health conditions that put you at risk for complications with coronavirus. I think that plus that so many Black people are working these essential jobs that are often not paying living wages, but are keeping this country running, like working at grocery stores or restaurants, and in transit and things like that. And that all that coupled together is just creating a whole political, economic, social storm that I think is going to leave a lot of people wondering where they can look to trust for any kind of guidance in general.
Rick, I'm curious. I'm a Bernie voter myself. I am the person on this particular channel that is pro-Sanders and that has been pro-Sanders for the entirety of this race. I wanted the best of Sanders. I wanted him to take a ruthless, fanatical devotion to accomplish his objective where everything else is subordinate. And we find out that he did not want to take certain positions for ideological reasons, but also for reasons that he considered Joe Biden his buddy. When looking over the race for 2020, he's dropped out. If there was an autopsy to be had of Sanders, where do you think it starts? And just to give you an example of some other people, I don't take this particular perspective, but this will be a perspective that people take. Darren Levy, Bernie Sanders has shown that he is a sheepdog of the DNC and never really believed in what he preached. Plus, I think Fayez and Weaver had something on him to blackmail him to drop out. Ignore the blackmail part. But the first part, the practice what you preach. You have all of these big existential issues that he brought forth, all of this pain and anguish that our society has that he is trying to remedy. And ultimately, it hit its head on the shores of Joe Biden is his friend. If an autopsy is to be had, where do you think it starts?
For me, I'm going to have to jump in there, Rick, since we're running out of time here at the end of the hour. Jamal, for me, it really does have his take on where he was going to communicate with the Black community across the United States. Obviously, people did vote for him within Black communities. Black people aren't a monolith, but there was a subset of that community that he just didn't reach out to after the 2016 failures of his campaign and wasn't able to build new momentum ultimately. And the DNC establishment was able to blunt it from the start. But with that, Jamal, we do need to take a break after the end of our first hour. Big thank you to Jim Carpenter and Rick Banks for joining us. After our minute break, we're back with Lee Camp, our weekly mystery segment, and Vice President Mike Pence's attempts at rallying the troops. It did not go well, to say the least. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in DC. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my wingman, Bob Schlehuber, here in spirit anyway. Let's keep this momentum going from a good first hour, and let's go against the grain. Lots to cover over the next hour, including one of my favorite segments, Mysteries. And as always, your calls and tweets are amply appreciated. This show is brought to you by you, and we appreciate the fact that you allow us to do it. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. So one of my audience members said Jamal Thomas is on suicide watch. I'm okay. Not in bad straits. The world is good. There's problems, but things are okay. So my audience and this channel, and to some degree, my producer and co-host, Bob Schlehuber, just through the logic and the mechanics of proximity, they have to deal with me working through complicated feelings regarding Bernie Sanders, particularly with this election. And considering that Bernie Sanders has dropped out today, this section is that much more apt. Under the extra large fig leaf of working on a political show, I find myself doing them to a lesser degree what I do to my wife. Basically, 3 a.m, something strikes my fancy and I'm texting them and sending them my political opinion using my a certain degree of righteous indignation and a cosmic sense of correctness to make my points. I'm a political animal. I can't necessarily help it. But to discuss the root of my complicated feelings and to see if he has also been having complicated feelings, disturbances to his emotional balance, we are joined by Lee Camp, comedian, activist, journalist, host of the show Redacted Tonight on RT America, and author of recent book Bullet Points and Punchlines, to talk about the latest. Lee, what's going on? How are you doing today? Lee, can you hear me?
He dropped.
Oh, okay. Lee will be back shortly. But basically, we're going to have a conversation on what's going on dealing with Sanders dropping out the race, what it means for the left, and basically what's left of this movement that basically Sanders was the spearhead of. One of my biggest concerns was that I didn't see anything beyond Sanders in the way that the left had organized itself. Ultimately, we had a situation where Bernie was running, everybody put their eggs into that Bernie basket, and you ended up with a situation where if he goes kaput, all of it goes kaput with him, unless he creates some kind of nerve center or something where he can effect his political will. But let me get back to my original point about my complicated feelings about the primary. There is a seething rage in me that leaks out, or that's been leaking out over the last few weeks of the show. It feels like this primary was incomplete. Basically, all 25 warriors lined up. This guy had a box cutter. This guy had a gun or snuck a gun into the place. This other guy had a machete. And my guy, my warrior, my champion, steps out large with an ink pen. And he writes down one rousing speech after the next, and one rousing speech after the next, and one rousing speech after the next. And all of them are good. And everybody else is stabbing him and jabbing him and cutting him. And he's just giving his speeches, even when it comes up on Bupkas. Unfortunately, the speeches thing looked like it worked, but at a certain point, it fell apart. And when it fell apart, it didn't seem like he had anything else to go back to. And you find out later that Joe Biden was a buddy. It feels like this primary is incomplete. For example, let's hear the clip of Obama in 2008 going against Hillary Clinton and tell me if there's any level of hedge or friendship. And keep in mind, Obama is an insurgent campaign at this point, meaning Obama is running this particular campaign in this particular race with the thought that Hillary Clinton is inevitable. And he played all the stops, ruthless, a fanatical devotion to an idea. He believed back when he was an infant that he was going to be president of the United States and Hillary Clinton wasn't going to stop him from doing it. Let's hear the clip.
It's what's wrong with politics today. Hillary Clinton will say anything to get elected. Now she's making false attacks on Barack Obama. The Washington Post says Clinton isn't telling the truth. She championed NAFTA, even though it has cost South Carolina thousands of jobs. And worst of all, it was Hillary Clinton who voted for George Bush's war in Iraq. Hillary Clinton, she'll say anything. and changed nothing.
Bob, Obama had no issue at all in saying that woman lies. And the funny part is, this is one of those situations where he had no issue going after her. And Sanders wouldn't do that. Lee, welcome back to the show. How's it going, man?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
How you guys doing?
We're doing great. I just showed a video of Obama going after Hillary Clinton in the 2008 election. And my point in this is Obama had no issue with making it very clear that my job is to win this presidency. Being buddies with Clinton is not on the agenda for me to do this. And yet Sanders had no such proclivities, despite the fact that what he wants is these big, expansive issues and to get rid of these pain and these existential problems of climate. I need to save the world. But Biden is my buddy. It feels like this primary is incomplete to me. Now, do you feel that Sanders missed an opportunity? And how do you perceive this particular primary, especially in the context of Sanders just dropping out the race?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like almost through the whole thing, he was allergic to kind of really going at like Biden or some of the others. He would talk about everything in these broad terms, which I think generally these things should be discussed in broad terms, how the workers and the average people are being exploited and destroyed, how the wealth is being extracted to the top, how many people are struggling from healthcare. But then he would avoid saying, Joe Biden, your lies and your dishonest policies and your neoliberal crap is the reason we're in this situation. He wouldn't really go at him, at least not often. And that's the way he's always been. I think you're absolutely right that he thought he was going to win this on ideas, just being nice to the other ruling elite, and that's not really how this works. But many of us kind of saw this writing on the wall a long time ago. I mean, even before a single vote had been cast, I never really understood why Bernie Sanders thought the rigging in this primary was going to be any different than the rigging in 2016. Nothing really had changed. The same games were at play. The DNC was as powerful as before with running the state machines and either causing just complete chaos like we saw in Iowa so that Bernie couldn't get the bump he needed from winning Iowa, or straight up, closing polling places like they did in Texas and making sure Bernie Sanders could not get the numbers that polls were showing he was going to get. So, it's all the same crap that we saw last time around, the provisional ballots in California, millions of people completely disenfranchised. And the Democrats, the Democratic establishment, proudly said in court that they have the right to rig the primary, and they did it again. And I'd say even almost worse than not calling out Biden is not calling out the manipulation. Bernie Sanders has never really been into discussing how horrific these primaries are and how much he was robbed.
Yeah. I agree with you in part. Wait, Bob, I agree with you in part, Lee.
Sure.
Only in part. And I agree with you in part, but I have to be honest, I always get slightly aggravated with the perspective that it was rigged. Sanders came into this race knowing that everybody was against him. They were against him in 2016. He knew everybody that was on that stage that wasn't named Bernie Sanders was going to be against him. And beyond knowing that, he knew every television network was going to be against him. The newspaper was going to be against him. It's an establishment. All the incentives in the world that make an establishment what it is were in play and was going to resist Sanders and his band of Murray, workers and poor were changing that. And so Sanders goes into that process knowing that there's a certain degree of handicap. I agree with you that you should call for transparency in regards to the elections. But I don't take this off Sanders because he knew what he was getting into. He knew that he was going to have an issue with the
That's the irony, though, Jamarl.
But
isn't that the irony?
Well,
isn't that the irony, Jamarl, for the sense that they were able to say, they pinned him on it, that Bernie Sanders wanted to burn down the party, right? They said, if this one candidate wants to burn the thing down, and that's the great irony, is Bernie Sanders should have came out and said, this whole thing needs to be burned down.
Yes.
And Sanders deflected from that. He didn't want to take that fight on. And not only did he not get to take that fight on, amplified the corruption of the Democratic Party, he basically stood back, let his opponent say that's what he is saying, and then no one actually ever said how corrupt this party is, and here we are again with Joe Biden.
Yes, that literally. I mean, I guess my feeling is I blame Sanders. And I know some people don't like me saying that. They're like, oh, dude, how are you going to hit Sanders? He's a lovable guy. I get he's a lovable guy. But if you're going to tell me that all of these issues matter, all of these big existential, the world is at stake. The world is falling off its axis. That was basically the way that he ran, the sense of urgency. But I can't hit him because he's my buddy. Look, you have to take every opportunity that's at your disposal in a process where you are trying to take down an establishment figure. Look at what Obama did. Obama had no grievances with doing that. They were going to attack Sanders. They were going to blame him if she lost anyway. They blame him for Hillary Clinton's losing. They're going to say all bad things about him. They attacked his supporters. They went so far when they couldn't lay a glove on Sanders to say his supporters were racist and sexist, and that they were just by virtue of voting for Sanders, it indicates that you are sexist because Elizabeth Warren is effectively Sanders with a vagina. Like, this is the stuff that they were talking about. And Sanders got in the race and effectively said, Joe Biden is going to get my support, or whoever wins is going to get my support regardless. Not leveraging the mob and the various people he has to get policy concessions. I'm sorry. I understand that all of these races, they were screwing around on the edges and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, Sanders hit his head on the black vote, just like Bob said. And when he got situations where Nina Turner said, Sanders, the black vote was betrayed. Joe Biden betrayed the black community. What did Sanders do? He backed away from it. Even on the debate stage, he backed away from it. The very demographic that he had to get, he didn't make a play for that vote. What did Kamala Harris do? Think back. Kamala Harris, when she got the opportunity to go after Joe Biden, she says, I was that black kid, Joe Biden. I was that black child. Why? Because she understood that Joe Biden was getting the black vote and she needed to get it. And she was willing to carve it out of him. When Sanders was in the position of being asked that Joe Biden betrayed the black community, he could have said on issues of Social Security and Medicare that Joe Biden was against, yes, because the African-American community uses it most. And when Joe Biden is out there talking about being part of the civil rights in the 80s, he said himself that he was never part of the civil rights. I walked with King, and it bugs me as a man that walked with King that this man will get out here and say that. That's what you do to win. And so if I look at and I see Joe Biden getting 3/4 of the black vote and Sanders never contested Joe Biden going from church to church, lying from one black person to the next, then how am I going to blame Joe Biden for saying or taking advantage of Sanders' ideological problems? This is why I get a little, triggered on this notion of they rigged it. Yes, they did rig it, but by the same token, he never threw a punch. He never fought for it. And that's the part that eats into me. Am I wrong on that, Lee? Am I missing something?
Well, Jamal, these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can blame Bernie for the things you're talking about, which I also blame him for. But I think to just do that and ignore how corrupt and rigged this system is seems kind of ridiculous to me. I mean, I think you can, just like all of us can walk and chew gum at the same time, I think we can do both. We can say Bernie Sanders should have been calling out these things. He should have been attacking Joe Biden. And we can also say, hey, you closed hundreds of polling places in Hispanic areas in Texas because you knew Bernie Sanders was going to do well there. I don't think that needs to get a pass because Bernie Sanders didn't yell enough about Joe Biden. I think both of these things are important, and I think they both need to be screamed about. And let's face it, Bernie Sanders is old. This may be towards the end of his political life, and we've got to move past this. So what are the things we're taking with us after we leave this campaign? I think it should be systemic change is needed, and how ridiculous our electoral system is. I mean, it's the worst in the Western world. It's a complete garbage show. It's designed for the ruling elite, and that's something that we can keep talking about, whether Bernie Sanders is there or not.
Yeah, and then the autopsy, I think, will continue to unfold here in the next few weeks, Jamal. And for me, one of the biggest kind of things around Bernie Sanders that wasn't talked about is surely he obviously was much more involved in the 1960s when it came to civil rights in actually showing up and being on the ground at the March for Washington, unlike Joe Biden. The biggest problem for Sanders, for me in many ways, is kind of the then what? What about the 70s, 80s, 90s? Where were you in the American South organizing with Black communities that had to continue to fight for civil rights? And I think that's where he ultimately said, hey, I want to be the senator in Vermont. It's a very white state. It's in the Northeast. I'm going to push progressive legislation and policies from there. But we didn't see Bernie Sanders enter back into Southern politics. If he could this whole time say, yeah, not only was I there in the late 1960s, but then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this with this church, with this big nonprofit organization in the South. And I'm not slamming the guy. I don't think the guy ever wanted to be the president of the United States. He was pushed and pressured after other people didn't step up. So kudos for him for even stepping up when he got drafted and pressured. But at the same time, I think some of these other criticisms of Sanders haven't really necessarily stuck out to show why he was difficult to get the Jim Clyburns or even John Lewis. And people surprised by John Lewis endorsing Joe Biden yesterday. You aren't paying attention to John Lewis the last decade of American politics. He didn't get off the bench for Stacey Abrams, and he surely wasn't going to do anything for Bernie Sanders. But kind of this longer notion of Bernie Sanders wasn't the hero I think a lot of people were looking for. Great man, well-respected. He should be elevated. But Lee, it seems like he's not going to be the standard bearer of leftist politics. But now where do they turn? And I think there's a huge lack of the future of American leadership in politics. Who leads after Donald Trump in the Republican Party? I'm not sure who has the same audacity to lie like he does, and that seems like where that party is. Obviously, if Joe Biden was the best the Democrats had, you should be greatly concerned if all you can find out of your Democratic Party is Joe Biden. That says something about the lack of leadership. And I guess people are looking at an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but she's one person who's really popular on Twitter. I got to imagine a lot of America doesn't know her yet. And so this moment right now speaks volumes to the lack of political leadership in this country.
Well, I think really what we've seen is we've seen the two parties consolidate even more into a joint system of a single corporate party. And, I'm not really that worried that they won't they won't vomit up a new leader after Donald Trump moves on or whatever. I think there's plenty of horrific sociopaths, millionaires and billionaires who can pick up that mantle. But the real problem, I think, in political leadership and political organization is the true left of this country has just been completely destroyed and gutted. And we're those of us who even try and speak the ideas are told we shouldn't be allowed on corporate media and we're suppressed online. And Bernie Sanders, even though he's not even a radical if you compare him to most other countries, but he is in America. And even he could hardly get any media coverage when he's running for president. So, it really shows the success that the corporate state has had in taking over both the airwaves and the government and, the seats of power and the criminal justice system as well. So just on every level, they've captured the regulators and we're just seeing more of that. So I think, we're getting to a breaking point, and I think coronavirus is highlighting all of these things, that this system is not meant for the people. It's not there to save the people. It's incapable of helping the people in a time of crisis because you have two parties that are one party that are only about profit. And they don't prepare long-term because they're about short-term profit, short-term greed. So there is no preparation for a crisis like this. And, hopefully people will take the right lessons away from this economic collapse combined with pandemic. And they'll realize that this unfettered capitalist system is not about helping people. It's about extracting all the wealth and resources to a tiny number of households.
Lee, I got a question for you. So where does the left go now, right? I mean, because it seems like we put all of our eggs into the Sanders basket. And my hope was that Sanders was going to use this campaign because he's, in real terms, head of this kind of revolution, but at the same token has a foot in politics, which in some respects is a strength because you can kind of marshal those two things together. But if this campaign fizzles out, if he doesn't create a nerve center, like webbing together all of these people, all of these millions of people across the United States that went to his rallies and that backed him in this case, where does the left go? It just seems like I don't know what comes after Sanders.
Well, I think either the sad truth, or I suppose some might see it as the optimistic truth, is that I think true change nowadays is going to lie largely outside of electoral politics, or maybe somewhat in local electoral politics. But the federal system has been so gamed and taken over and corrupted that, as we saw with Bernie Sanders, but as we see with almost every race, I mean, how many true leftists are even in Congress? Forget the presidency, even in Congress at all. So it's been, I mean, the DCCC makes sure that the Democrats are running or not, outside of the allowable corporate box. And so there really is hardly any So I think that the change we're going to see in this world, and it's going to happen outside of electoral politics. It's these organizations, it's, Mutual Disaster Aid and various other groups that are getting together and creating change for that, filling in the gaps where the corporate state just doesn't give a crap about human beings anymore. And I think that those ideas, even though they may seem small, even though some of these organizations may seem small, those ideas are what will be the future if we're able to make the change we need to, not go extinct in the next 30 years. I think that they have proven to be completely bankrupt morally and ethically. And I think that these ideas need to keep growing. So hopefully some of the ideas of the Bernie Sanders campaign, the idea of healthcare as a human right, and college education as a human right, and housing as a human right, some of these will continue to grow, and that the populace will latch onto these, and it'll become toxic for a politician, maybe this is speaking 20 years down the line, to not agree with these things and not stand up for these things. Like it's largely toxic for a politician in Britain to say that you shouldn't have health care. It's got to be a complete revolution of the mind.
Lee,
yeah, absolutely. We have let's get Charles. We do have Charles on the line, who's been patiently waiting here with us on Political Misfits. Charles, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Hey, how y'all doing?
Good, man. Thanks for hanging on.
Have y'all heard of the Green Party guy, Howie Hawkins, offered Bernie the nomination of the Green Party again, like last time when Jill Stein offered it? Do you think we should push Bernie, maybe do a petition to accept that and run as a Green? And I'm curious as to where we go to from here, because it's like today.
Yeah.
And, when what they was talking about, I agree with Lee Camp. It's like you can't blame a man for losing a handicap race. Okay, you can say he knew it was handicapped. It's like you knew the boxer had concrete in his gloves, so you should have prepared your. I think the remedy should always be to give the nomination to the person that was cheated. If you know that there was any kind of cheating going on, it automatically nullifies the result and give it to the person that was cheated. That's the remedy, not to blame the person for not being able to overcome an uphill.
Charles, I hear you completely. Thank you for the call. Lee Camp should let me maybe turn Charles's question on its head a little bit. Should Bernie Sanders have never ran as a Democrat in the first place, but instead looked to, I don't know if the Green Party would have been best, but maybe an independent run from the start?
Well, yeah, I think many, and I had Howie Hawkins on Redacted Night a week ago, and he said the same thing, that Bernie Sanders knew the way this system worked, and he should have known from the beginning to run as a separate party. But by getting on those debate stages and things like that, he was able to push forward ideas that, third parties have just not been able to get up on that main stage. And because they are, censored and suppressed, I'm not denying that they have massive, mountainous organizations and corporations against them. Jill Stein was chained to a chair, for God's sakes, when she tried to attend the debate in 2012. So, but a good example of what maybe should have happened is Nick Brana left Bernie Sanders' organization back in 2016 and begged really Bernie Sanders to start a new party. And Nick Brana has continued with the movement for a People's Party and really wanted Bernie Sanders to kind of say to the Democratic Party, you have, rigged this system, and those who support me should leave the Democratic Party and become this other party. And I think that, Bernie Sanders has not shown the willingness to do that. He's never in his entire career shown a willingness to talk to the Green Party really and work with them at all. So, I don't know that he's the guy that's actually going to do something like that. But there are efforts to keep growing these certain third parties, Movement for a People's Party, Green Party, and others. But it is just incredibly hard in a system that is funded and owned by the corporate state.
It really is. But just to slightly push back on Charles's point, it's not so much that I believe that you entirely throw and douse all the blame on a particular candidate. I think you give credit where credit is due. I think my issue here is people often have to face difficulty and uphill battles. That's life. It's not a fair process. It's never a fair process, especially when you're running up against billions of dollars. This is not isolated to politics. This is just life in general. People have handicaps. People have conditions with family or whatever else. People have their conditions and their situations that they have to just overcome. My issue with Sanders here is that he didn't go to the mat for it. That's my only concern or only issue. When I'm pointing it out only in terms of, did he have options and opportunities? That answer is yes. Did he take every option and opportunity? The answer is, of course, radically no. That's my only point. As for the Green Party, I think the problem is what you make, Lee, that basically if you take the Green Party, you're going to be marginalized. Whereas he was in the potential where he was literally leading this race going into South Carolina, where everybody thought that, oh my God, Sanders is going to run away with it. So let's be clear. He did get opportunities in order to advance his interests. He just didn't take those. Lee, I want to point to a video of Trump. So we've been talking about Sanders in the Democratic Party. I want to show a video of how Trump is handling all of this crisis, just dancing and singing to try to dodge from the fact that he has a large amount of blood on his hands. Let's hear the clip of Trump talking to a reporter who's asking him about testing, and Trump is not liking this question.
Did I hear the word Inspector General? Really? It's wrong. And they'll talk to you about it. It's wrong.
But this is your own government.
Well, where did he come from, the Inspector General? What's his name?
It came from the Inspector General
No, what's his
report.
name?
I don't know his name.
Well, find me his name. Let me know, okay? If you find me his name, I'd appreciate it.
But, sir, these are hospitals.
All I can tell you is this: we put up on the board. You're going to ask the Admiral, but we are doing.
Who say that they're waiting a week or longer to get their test results. Why?
But we've done more testing and had more results than any country anywhere in the world.
That is utterly hilarious. Hey, you don't have the test kits because you didn't do your job. Well, what's his name? What's his name? What's his name? But Trump doesn't seem to be handling this well, Lee.
No, it's his classic playbook. When you've caught doing horrible things, just distract, go at the person asking you the question, or a terrible reporter. This is the playbook of a con man. This playbook is not new, and really this shows how these ruling elite like Trump, perhaps Trump's the worst of them, but many of them are not capable of actually caring for human beings. And right now we are in a unique crisis where Trump can't lie about it. He can't say something isn't happening that's not happening, because people can look around and see that it's happening. They are dying. Their hospitals are full. Blood is on his hands. And so he's completely inadequate to deal with that. And it's not just him, it's his entire administration. These are sociopaths that have been pushed to the top of this disgusting system that rewards sociopathy. And so asking him to care for human beings that are sick in hospital beds is hilarious. It's like asking an ice cream shop owner to hire the Human Torch. It's just completely unthinkable. And so and what he's doing instead is just a combination of distraction and yelling at people that ask him legitimate questions.
Yeah, and so, Lee, what does happen there as Donald Trump demands to know the Inspector General's name who is out there? He finds another Inspector General, one Glenn Fine, who is the current acting Inspector General for the Defense Department and who is set to be the Inspector General to oversee the $2.2 trillion of taxpayer coronavirus pandemic relief bill. Donald Trump removes him from the Defense Department, which basically makes him ineligible to be the new Inspector General. So now we have nobody overseeing Donald Trump. We have internal memos from the Trump administration going back to January saying, hey, a pandemic is coming. You better prepare yourself. We see that corporations are being bailed out again at the expense of people. Does this eventually catch up to Donald Trump, or is he the greatest showman on earth and will continue to distract those who already love the guy?
Well, it would have caught up to him, definitely, and he would have lost this election if, because you have an economic collapse combined with a crisis that the federal government has completely failed to deal with. So this absolutely would have sunk him if, and only if, the Democratic Party had given even a alternative, even a slightly different alternative, rather than a white, old, millionaire, senile man with sexual harassment history who has done, supported racist policies and war throughout his entire career and is funded largely by credit-colored companies and big banks. And you have two of the same people running against each other. And so, Joe Biden could absolutely lose this race, whereas anybody even slightly alternative to Donald Trump would have easily defeated him in this coming election. But instead, it'll be very close, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if he wins re-election.
But Lee, I guess I'm kind of curious, though, and maybe we just have a minute left of your time, which we greatly appreciate. Does the Democratic Party see it the same way? Do they care who the nominee is? I feel like the Democratic Party is simply banking that come November, it will simply be a referendum on Donald Trump. It's either you vote for Donald Trump or you vote for the other guy. The other guy can be the Joe Biden that you just mentioned with horrible policies. He might not do another campaign event between now and November, and that's okay to them. They're just banking simply, do you want Donald Trump to continue to be your president? Yes or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Democratic establishment would like to win this election in November, but I think far more important to them was just stopping Bernie Sanders, because they have far more in common with Donald Trump and his policies than they have in common with Bernie Sanders and his policies. So really for them, they have won this election in that they defeated Bernie Sanders. They very well may lose to Donald Trump in November, but I think they do want Biden to win, but they don't care as much as stopping Bernie Sanders, because look, Donald Trump has been very good for the ruling elite, including the Democratic establishment. He's given massive tax cuts to the rich. He's continued all of our wars overseas. Obama in his final year of office dropped 26,000 drone bombs, and Trump in his first year in office upped that to 40,000 drone bombs. So both of them are disgusting. Both of them are war criminals, but Trump has not slowed our military advancement in any way. The real reason the Democratic establishment doesn't like Donald Trump is that he's kind of revealing this accidentally through his idiocy and his ego, revealing the system for what it is. He's revealing how horrific and racist and disgusting the American political system is. And that's really the only reason they don't like him, not because his policies are really that different from most of the Democratic establishment.
Yeah, before I string together a series of curse words here, we're going to turn to a quick break so I can calm down a little bit. It's rather infuriating. Lee Camp, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, and everybody can check out my new book at leecamp.com.
Absolutely. That's Lee Camp, host of Redacted Tonight, leecamp.com. We are going to turn to a quick minute break before we come back with the latest mysteries from this planet, or maybe not this planet. Jamal Thomas will tell us more. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. We're back after this.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits?
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik?
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story? From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course, come on in.
Aren't you glad we didn't say MSNBC?
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. You hear that change in music. It is Wednesday. We are going to get weird. Today's mystery segment. As always, we appreciate your calls. We appreciate your tweets. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. So last night, Stephen Greer, I'm iffy on Greer, but nevertheless, it's kind of besides the point. Last night, Stephen Greer premiered a new film, Fifth Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Contact has begun. Now, I won't give a review of this film as much as I want to discuss a component of the film that shouldn't necessarily go understated that I think Stephen Greer is right on. He makes a great point about the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences and its front person, Tom DeLonge, and the organization of spooks that, for the most part, have surrounded this particular organization and Tom DeLonge, not to mention the way that they've explained this kind of notion of the phenomena. Meaning, the notion of UFOs and everything else that Tom DeLonge is exposing to the public is being cut in a language of threat, fear. And the fact that he has a lot of spooks around him, people part of the intelligence services, should not go unnoticed. Greer makes the point and goes further that he believes that he doesn't believe that per se. Tom DeLonge has this belief in the bad alien theory. DeLonge also has no direct contact experiences. Everything he's learned is either through spooks or through something he read, meaning he is not any more knowledgeable than anyone else. And if anything, what he believes as information that he's getting from spooks, he's taking this as if it's the word of God, as opposed to having a certain level of skepticism that he may be used as somewhat of a useful idiot to get out a narrative that may not necessarily be true. Think about what I'm saying here. Consider our politics. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Joe Biden, the Republican legislature, understanding that people could die. You could look what took place in Florida. Understanding that people could die. Joe Biden still wanted people to go to the polls and vote. Even knowing that the larger contingent of people that were dying were African Americans, it mattered more to Joe Biden that he could drag his decrepit self across the finish line in the primary, and he needed those people to vote immediately today because he didn't want to take the opportunity that he falls flat on his face if the election is postponed. He was willing to put all of those people's lives at stake for his own political ambitions. Same thing with the Republican legislature. You go further. In the middle of a pandemic, you have the Trump administration throwing pennies to the American public. People who don't have their rents being paid, people who have gas or electric bills, people who have car notes, people who have student loan debt, people who have medical debt. 3 million people all of a sudden no longer have health care. Understanding this is the situation to which you find in a society where the overwhelming majority of the people are running paycheck to paycheck. The concern of the Trump administration was to ensure the wealth of the nation, throwing pennies to the public. Much of that money won't even reach the public for months on end, if it reaches them at all, in the middle of a pandemic. His issue was we must make sure that the businesses are okay, and while the house is on fire, they decide to rob it. That's our politics. Those are the people who are in our political situation. The media doesn't look at that and say, that's weird. The media looked at that and said, that's perfectly okay. Both political parties were on board for this corporate heist. It was normal. The point I'm making to you that in a rational society, the resources of that society would be used for the people of that society. And in the middle of a pandemic, a rational government will say, everybody stay home. We're going to ensure that your wages are insured. We're going to try to find some way to keep many of these small businesses intact. That's a rational society. It wouldn't give that money. It wouldn't cater to the wealth of the nation. It would cater to the human beings in the nation because those are the people that produce the wealth of the nation. I'm saying you don't have a rational society that works in the interest of you and your interests and your material interests. You have a society that works in the interest of self-interest, rugged individualism, competition. I got mine, screw you. And that same idea works in the political space. They don't care about you. Now add aliens to that. What does that mean in the context of technology? Tom DeLonge is releasing all of this information, these weird physics that the government was studying, releasing these videos that the government was effectively looking after, assisting and releasing people who were effectively flying in airplanes saying, yes, I was watching this particular craft or that particular craft, having the New York Times and all of these publications release all of this information about UFO all of a sudden. Meaning the U.S. military starts working with Tom DeLonge and this particular organization, adding that much more legitimacy to it. I'm making the point to you that the narrative that is being put out is put out from the standpoint of something is invading our sky, something is invading our space, and that narrative from a public that for the longest time has been told that this wasn't real could freak them out. You're able to freak the public out about Venezuela. Venezuela is a national security at risk. Is Venezuela a national security risk? None of the press people said, wait a minute, how? And we're talking about something off of our shores. Now, I'm making the point that having these spooks and having this people come out with this particular narrative is their ability to shape a narrative to the American public without it coming directly from the military, but coming from this talking head that is still effectively spewing what is coming from the intelligence services. When the military starts dropping this and the public starts realizing, oh my God, there is something there, and the weird physics starts coming out, and the physicists start asking the question, how are they getting here? Your society fundamentally changes almost overnight, because the moment they ask that question, people will start coming up with answers for that question, and when they realize that there are limits to their physics, where their physics are somehow wrong, there's something else. And the very fact that they know that there's something else allows their mind to expand to actually meet that question. Your world changes. But what does that mean? Is that going to be dystopian in the sense where we have things flying in our space, where we've weaponized space because we're scared of something that's out there? Or is it a different vision where that technology is used for the interest of the public itself? What has it been over the last 100, 200 years? What do you expect it to be? And this is kind of my point. This can get terrifying and dystopian, especially if we have things where they're making the argument that we need to weaponize space and the world needs to unite and spend all of this money on military and come up with these weird, odd, exotic weapons. Bob, I find this to be a terrifying potential for reality. And Greer, for whatever his faults, is making an actual pretty legitimately good point in explaining, look, these things could turn pretty bad, especially if these guys are creating a narrative about threat, about something that is coming to get us, something that's going to eat us. They're going to be eating our babies. Well, from a public that has no ability to know the truth about that, the only narrative that they get is the narrative that's going to come from the government. And that in and of itself has often been askew and wrong, if not used for political motives. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Jamal, if you don't mind me borrowing a quote here from the famous band Blink-182 from their song Aliens Exist. It says, what if people knew that these things were real? I'd leave my closet door open all night. I know the CIA would say, what you hear is all hearsay. I wish someone would tell me what was right. I have to say, I know this isn't the point of your mystery segment today. I still can't get over that Tom DeLonge. All of my Blink-182 references, Aliens Exist, one of my favorite songs by this band, 20 years ago now. I mean, the fact that these guys are like in their late 40s, mid-40s.
He's been in it for a long time.
It's all just like, it's changing my whole perception of my teenage years of all the Blink-182 songs I listened to and consumed. And to think that this guy is somehow on the in, or at least near the answers that I don't have, I still can't like wrap my head around that. So that's the biggest mystery for me, is how did Tom DeLonge, one of my favorite musicians growing up, become the spooks guy with these people? But to your point, Jamal, my frustration has constantly been, look what we have in a system of capitalism that only cares about profit and not people. Some of the things in our world are pretty cool. I mean, we have some pretty amazing advancement. Modern medicine alone, the ability to travel the world on airplanes, technology right now, we're seeing the huge gains from it. And all of that is the least of what we could possibly have. That comes from constrained capitalism, that comes from racism, sexism, all of the toxicity within our societies and culture.
And then here you're telling me that we may have access to other physics that's beyond what we have. What are the possibilities? And that's what angers me the most, is the general public is denied knowledge, denied the education of what could possibly be out there and all of the things we could have as a people who don't have answers and don't necessarily have a purpose that we know about being here. And yet we're being denied by the Tom DeLonges of Blink-182 of the world of some more answers.
I feel you. I agree with you. It's funny. You know, he's been in this for so long, like going all the way back, like you said, in his music. And, you know, it gets weirder than that. When you look back at the Podesta emails, Tom DeLonge is all through those emails. He's all over the place. I mean, it's astonishing, like the number of UFO references, because, you know, John Podesta was heavy into the UFO stuff. And Tom DeLonge kind of just fell into it. Like, he was a rock star. He wanted to meet, you know, various people. And, you know, they hooked him up with spooks. And they told him, and he's like, look, we're going to give you people to go out there where you can kind of push this message. Now, everybody thought Tom DeLonge was full of it. Nobody believed them. And then when the Hillary stuff came out, you found him. He was all the way through it. He did have those connections. It's so bizarre. It's such a bizarre story.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jamal. As always, I'm left with more questions than answers after these segments. My head is spinning, to say the least. Jamal, let's take a quick minute break so I can get my head on straight. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schleber here, kind of, sort of, with Jamal Thomas. Big shout out to our engineers there, making sure we can come to you live daily from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Make sure to stick around for some great programming on Radio Sputnik. After this, you have By Any Means Necessary with Sean Blackman and Jacqueline Lukman. And from 4 to 6 o'clock p.m. daily, Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou. A few final news tidbits here for you misfits out there. Guys, get your fist pumping. Get those USA chants going, because the old red and blue and white is on top again. Yes, that's right, Jamal. The U.S. yesterday recorded the world's highest 24-hour death toll, with more than 1,850 deaths from the coronavirus on Tuesday. On the same day, China lifted its 11-week lockdown of the city of Wuhan, the first epicenter of the outbreak. A little ironic, don't you think? The Washington Post also reports that states across the country are putting together guidelines to follow if and when they have to start rationing ventilators. Rationing ventilators from a completely preventable pandemic that we're now in. Different states are trying to work out who should get this life-saving treatment if there's not enough to go around. So hospitals are anticipating having to make these decisions. Do you give this ventilator to a pregnant woman, to a doctor or nurse, to politicians, cops, the young, the elderly, to people with families over single people? These are terrible questions to have to answer. It's Trump and the GOP's failure that are going to lead to many death panels popping up across the nation. Jamal, the psychological toll from this pandemic will be long-lasting, to say the least.
This is be a defining moment of people's lives, the nightmares, the regrets, the second guessing of decisions. And what is Donald Trump doing? He's continuing to point blame at other people, other agencies, and other nations around the world, and not taking any of the blame here at home or doing what is needed to save people's lives. Let's play this latest clip here of Donald Trump pointing fingers again at the World Health Organization.
We're going to look into it. We give a majority of the money that they get, and it's much more than the 58 million dollars is a small portion of what they've gotten over the years. Sometimes they get much more than that. Sometimes it's for programs that they're doing, and it's much bigger numbers. And if the programs are good, that's great as far as we're concerned. But we want to look into it. World Health Organization, because they really are. They called it wrong. They missed the call. They could have called it months earlier. They would have known, and they should have known, and they probably did know. So we'll be looking into that very carefully.
And Jamaro, what does it matter when the World Health Organization said anything? When they did say anything, Donald Trump did nothing. When Peter Navarro, his trade advisor there in China with deep connections in the country, was saying, hey, this thing's going to be really bad, Donald Trump said, we got it under control. We'll be back open by April. So the mere fact he has the audacity, I know this is Donald Trump. We're 3.5 years into this thing. I'm not surprised by this whatsoever. But for him to come out now and say, we're going to withhold funding from the World Health Organization because they're China-centric, regardless of that being true, it doesn't mean Donald Trump couldn't have reacted much, much sooner when he had available information.
That's right. They knew this for months. Let's be very clear, but very plain. They understood and knew for months what was coming. They could look at China and see the measures that China was taking in this particular regard. Trump just sat on his hands. What the article that you ran the other day, they knew the economic impact and they knew what was going to be the human impact. And Trump didn't use the Defense Production Act. Trump didn't ensure that each and every American could be in their homes safely with money to ensure that they can get from point A to point B, maybe not necessarily losing their salaries, or for that matter, even $2,000, and ensuring that that money was going to get to them before rent was due, not in 4 months, before rent was due. He had options. The president has vast powers and abilities to force companies to make the products that you need, the testing kits, the protective masks, the ventilators, and they just didn't do it. Like, don't blame this on China. Don't blame this on any other country. This was the malfeasance and the screw-up of your United States government. Incompetent Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and the capitalistic system, because they could have made those ventilators for like $100. They just didn't do it because they couldn't make a profit off it. They could have made those vaccines. They could have made those masks. They didn't do it. They couldn't make a profit. Blame all of that stuff. This is an outright systemic failure. And I hope that society regards it as such, Bob.
Yeah, the few other stories just to touch on here, we can dig into them deeper tomorrow for our listeners. Those following the firing or at least replacement of Brett Crozier, if you remember, the naval leader of the ship, the USS Teddy Roosevelt, the captain there, he was removed from his post last week when he let leak a letter talking about the outbreak of COVID-19 on his ship. In response, the acting Naval Secretary Tom Modly flies to Guam, talks to those on the ship, and basically calls Crozier stupid and naive, and then dropped a bunch of swear words. Well, after those remarks, Modly now, Jamar, has stepped down and resigned from his position. The Undersecretary of the Army, James McPherson, has been nominated to replace Modly in the meanwhile. So it did not work out there. I'm sure people were frustrated at Crozier for letting the letter leak, but thank goodness, Tom Modly, who are you right now? And on top of it, the USS Roosevelt, 79% of the 4,800 crew members have been tested for the virus. 230 of those sailors have tested positive. The Navy has moved the remaining some 2,000 sailors to quarantine facilities on Guam. Yeah, Jamar, good riddance, Thomas Modly.
Yeah, good riddance to bad rubbish. Honestly, what did they expect the guy to do? I mean, not this guy, who, good for him to resign. I'm talking about the captain who wrote the message, basically saying the people on the ship are going to get ill. I don't have the resources to deal with this. And they effectively attacked him, called the guy stupid and naive. I mean, just rails at the guy. And you're like, but what did you expect him to do? Did he not have a responsibility philosophically, morally, ethically to the people on that ship to ensure that they were made whole and safe? And they're like, no, the problem is that you said something about it, not that this was taking place on the ship. That's an like, honestly, Bob, look at your society for the moment. And well, your society is organized in a way where the story and the issue that your society takes, meaning from a power dynamic in regards to how your society regards right and wrong, government-wise. Your government says the problem is that you said something. The problem is not that this was taking place. It's astonishing.
Yeah, it makes me think of Anthony Scaramucci, the brief press secretary, communications director at the White House, who was let go, I think, after some 8 days here with Modley. It's like, Modley, like, I know we're on the same page, but you're not the one. You don't get to go out and say that stuff. Only Donald Trump gets to say people are stupid, that they're naive. Only he gets to do that. Modley, you got to be a little bit more tactful with this. Jamal, I wanted your thoughts on one last story here. Coming on the heels of U.S. Vice President Mike Pence giving a show up and do your job speech to essential workers. He basically said to essential workers at a Tyson chicken plant, addressing them, you are vital. You are giving a great service to the people of the United States, and we need you to continue as part of what we call critical infrastructure to show up and do your job. Pence basically giving a rally and a speech, while at the same time here, Chuck Schumer, Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer has called for up to $25,000 for heroes pay for frontline healthcare and service industry workers as Congress pushes ahead with a new coronavirus crisis rescue package. Schumer declared the emergency proposal the highest priority for Democrats as congressional leaders and President Donald Trump plunge with more aid for Americans. Nurses, truck drivers, grocery store clerks, and others are, quote, risking their lives to care for Americans amid the stark pandemic and economic shutdown, according to Schumer. Jamal, I've gotten quite cynical with Democrats. I want to believe that they'll actually try to push forward this heroes pay, but I mean, it obviously stinks of a PR ploy. Am I too cynical here? Does Chuck Schumer actually care about these heroes?
I don't believe they care about us. Like, and honestly, that needs, when I think of politics and I think of like this kind of ideological shift in regards to our population, maybe it takes this mass, utter, and entirely outright, complete, like just full-throated discrediting of the system across the board, where Americans come away with this conclusion that they don't care about me, and come to that conclusion from flesh to bone, and start acting in this context of, well, we need to function as one class. The economics of this country need to change, all of that stuff, meaning getting a different fundamentally point of view of that stuff. I don't believe Chuck Schumer cares about me. Chuck Schumer is putting out this deal. Maybe, I don't know the guardrails around it. Is it possible that they're going to have limits on it? Is it possible they're going to have means testing? That, you know, this is one of those things Democrats like to do. We like to have means testing, that type of stuff. Like, I don't know what this is going to end up being. If it just is blanket, you know, is this kind of like the Trump stuff, where Trump is like, coronavirus, Medicare for all with the coronavirus. If this is indeed what they say it is, and they're talking about $25,000 extra for people on the front lines, good. I mean, they deserve it, right? Like, these guys are working at these stores. These guys are fixing our foods at these warehouses. They were always valuable. And we, in this society, made it as if, because of the wages that we would give them, as if they were somehow less meritorious of a decent life or just a basic subsistence of sorts. This is utterly astonishing. So, yeah, I agree with you, Bob.
I don't buy it as much as there's plenty of cities across the nation that are experiencing the worst of this pandemic that are run by Democrats. We're seeing New York City hit extremely hard, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Los Angeles. Those are Democratic-run cities. This was preventable, and they could have done so much more before the crisis. And now that the crisis is arising, Donald Trump is doing nothing. Now Schumer talks about how much he cares about the everyday people. Well, we had to get out of here for today. Jamarl Thomas, big thank you to our guests, Jim Carpenter, Chad Nicholson, and Lee Camp. A big thank you to our producer, Michelle Whitty, and our engineers, Saul, Ryan, Dimitri, and Andre. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new show. Big thank you to all of you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, I want to thank you all for showing up for the show. This is the new way I think I'm going to try to run the show from here on out, dealing with the show. I mean, I think it's easier and I think it's better when you have an actual image and you can actually see who you're talking to. Not to mention we can add images and everything else into the show itself. I want to read some of these super chats. Maggie Smith tried to call in. The number was unreachable. Okay, we're going to check that, Maggie. Egg64. Bernie drops out. Pandemic, worldwide financial collapse. Whomever took the slab, please return it. Whoever took the slab, please return it indeed. Please return it indeed. There was one more, and I don't want to miss it. But for some reason, I can't see it. So let's pull up. And this one is Curry Mac. Bernie, you can't win Lotto if you don't buy a ticket. Highly camp. What you think? Gary Mac, I think you're absolutely right. You can't win Lotto if you don't buy a ticket. I'm going to end this here. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you guys for joining us.